Please be seated. There's an old saying that the job of the preacher is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I think we can thank Jesus for doing his part today as he proclaims this radical reordering of the world that the reign of God represents. It really is a world that is turned upside down, and you can't understate that. Nor, I think, our tendency to want to domesticate that. Being the comfortable Christians of the Western industrialized world that we are, this part of the gospel can make us a little nervous. At a Bible study recently, someone asked as we were chatted about this, isn't he really just talking about spiritual poverty? You know, those who are trying to get to know God? And so doesn't that really just include all of that, all of us? So aren't we all blessed? Well, actually, that's Matthew's version. This is Luke's. This is the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus isn't on a mountain, he's down on our level, talking about real life, real poverty. Okay, well, isn't he just really condemning excess? You know, is this preaching moderation about consumerism and materialism? Isn't it it's the people with the Learjets and the gold-plated bathroom fixtures? Those are the folks that we need to worry about, right? Nice try. But Luke makes a point that he is looking right at his disciples here. And they certainly weren't the super rich. No, I think it's pretty clear he's describing people that more or less have what they need. People with comfortable, happy lives. Remember, it doesn't take much to get us into the top 7% of the wealthiest in the world. All you need is food on the table when you're hungry, clothes in the closet when you need them, a bed to sleep in at night, and a roof over your head. So in God's reordering of the world, it's the happy and the comfortable who should be worried, and it's the poor, the miserable, the hopeless, they're the ones that are blessed. Really? Have you ever experienced real poverty? I know many of us were probably starving students at one point, but what about losing a job that causes you to lose a home? What about an illness that isn't covered, that leads to bankruptcy or public assistance? After my own parents divorced, I will never forget being at the checkout line at the grocery store. I couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, and I was helping my mom bag up our groceries, and I was suddenly asked to stop because we didn't have enough money. And I remember being asked to take the food back out, one by one, and give it back to the cashier until we had what we could afford. And I will never forget everyone in line staring at us, and that awkward feeling of shame. Even as a kid, it felt as though our family was a failure. And I felt for my mom, who was doing the best she could. So blessed? I can't say I felt particularly blessed on that day. But what does it mean to be blessed anyway? We say it all the time, don't we? I feel blessed to have such a nice car. I feel blessed to be in such a beautiful house. I got that promotion I was after. It's been such a blessing. I found such a wonderful church to be a part of. It's such a blessing to me. We basically equate blessing with being fortunate. having the comfort, the security, the health, and the happiness that we all strive for. Friends who speak well of us, a sense of hope around the future. It's essentially living the American dream, isn't it? But that's just it. The blessings that we most often refer to are the very things Jesus is warning us against. And notice, if we equate God's blessing and with happiness and getting the things we want, aren't we all kind of preaching that prosperity gospel that we see from late night televangelists? You know, the one where God is basically Santa Claus, an old man with a white beard, sitting on a big chair somewhere far away, going over his list, checking it twice, judging the naughty, blessing the nice. Despite sermons after sermons about God's grace, does a religion of merit and reward and punishment, with God as a kind of heavenly scorekeeper, does that still lurk somewhere deep within us? Maybe that explains why we are still asking, why do bad things happen to good people? That's not the way Santa works it. I had someone come up to me this past week, total stranger. She saw my collar and she said, I have a question. I've been going to church my whole life. I'm trying to be a better person. I really am. I pray every day, but I just can't keep falling back into my old habits. And I could hear the sincerity and the desperation in her voice. And she asked, why doesn't God answer me? Do I need to pray harder? Is that the problem? And I told her without thinking, no. You don't need to pray harder. You need to stop being so hard on yourself. God has already forgiven you. God has already fallen in love with you. And there's nothing you're going to do or not do that will ever change that. So don't beat yourself up for not being perfect. Trust in God's perfect love. And I could see a weight being lifted from her. And I could see a smile return to her face, as if she had been reminded of something that she knew, but had somehow forgotten. Maybe that's the kind of blessing that Jesus is talking about. You see, contrary to the way we frequently talk about it, Jesus doesn't mean success or prosperity, security or comfort or happiness or even health. When he talks about blessings and being blessed, he's talking about our relationship with God, our standing with God, our willingness to rely on God. As we heard from the prophet Jeremiah, the blessed are those who trust in God. And so could it be that the true blessing of God means to have nothing but God? Could it be that God's blessing isn't in gifts, but in our willingness to embrace powerlessness and to surrender the things that finally lead us to God? Seen in that light, perhaps it's time we stopped looking at the poor as recipients of charity and started to see them as possible spiritual guides. Not as objects to be pitied, but as fellow pilgrims who may have lost everything, but have found the way. The poor and the powerless are blessed because they know their need for a Savior. and they can remind the comfortable what that looks like. And I think we all need an occasional reminder. Because the reality is, most of us don't become powerless voluntarily. As Americans, we're all about self-reliance, right? We don't ask for help. We don't like to admit defeat. My favorite guru, Richard Rohr, calls it, or analogizes it, to an addict on the road to recovery. You need to bottom out on your way of doing life before you will draw upon a larger source of life. Until there is an event or a situation or a conflict that we can no longer control and we can no longer manage, we never look for the real manager. Thankfully, life will send us moments, many of them, that will bring us to our knees. The heat, the seasons of drought that Jeremiah describes. These are chances that can bring us back to God. I discovered it for myself several years ago. Life was going really well for me. My partner at the time, we had been together for 10 years. Our families were close. He had just made partner at a big law firm downtown. We had a beautiful home. Things were going well. And without asking, we had been put on a kind of a pedestal as a model gay couple. And we had this really public life, a large network of friends. We got invited to all the right parties. And, truth be told, the view from that pedestal was pretty nice. After spending much of my life feeling excluded, in second class, it felt like I had finally made it. I was finally getting my part of the American dream. Until one day, out of the blue, he told me that he had met someone else. And without warning, it all blew up in my face. Everything I thought I could rely on, my identity, my security, our friends, our families, even my home, all of that was suddenly coming apart. And the worst part was, I knew this was going to go down in front of everybody. The cathedral where I worked, our community, our friends and family. Suddenly I was that 7-year-old kid again, feeling like a failure in front of the world. I went into denial. I did everything I could to keep up appearances, to hold it all together. I didn't talk to anyone about it. I wanted to somehow fix this and get it all solved without anyone ever discovering. And of course, none of that worked. Until finally one day, physically and emotionally exhausted, I wandered into the cathedral. And I found myself collapsing onto the altar rail and praying in a way that I'd never prayed before. I am lost. Show me the way. Looking back, I assure you, I believed in God. I'd gone to confirmation. I'd been baptized. I went to Bible studies. I was working at the church, for crying out loud. But the truth is, I'd always been in control. Things had always gone my way. And if they didn't, I had no doubt I would always figure something out. Until that point in my life, I really had never needed God. Have you had such an epiphany? Possibly more than once? And if you have, then you might recall there's a moment where you have to make a choice. Confronted with suffering and powerlessness, do we run from it? Or do we surrender to it? Do we double down on our ego and our false self and lash out with anger and victimhood? Do we try to manage it with even more control? Or do we let go and let ourselves fall into the waiting arms of God? In my case, I had to decide, am I going to vilify my ex? Am I going to cast myself as the victim? Am I going to force our friends to choose sides? Or would I trust in God enough to drop the pretense and admit that I had a part in this too? He wasn't the villain. I wasn't the victim. And as I began to let go, I learned I could forgive. As I opened up to others, I found that God was there in the form of our church family and our friends who didn't see us as failures, but as two people needing to be held. And they loved us through that terrible, blessed time. Looking back, I see now that it was probably my first real prayer that I said that day, and the first time that I had experienced God's real blessing. And it's a lesson that I continue to relearn. But the good news is, no matter how lost we ever feel, no matter how many times we have to be reminded, we can always return to God. And Jesus will always be there, waiting to lead us home, where we are loved, where we are forgiven, and have been all along. Amen.